Hey, what's up guys? My name is Jeremy, the Critical Thinker. Today we're talking about the problem of evil. If God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? So I wanted to tackle the problem of evil because this is one of the most common arguments that you hear today, both in university settings and in popular culture settings, against the existence of God, or at least the existence of a good and loving God. The argument has been around for thousands of years, but it really rose to prominence in the mid-20th century when philosophers like J.L. Mackie argued that the concept of an all-powerful, all-good, all-loving, all-knowing God is really inconsistent with the fact that evil exists. I came face to face with this argument often as a philosophy student in college, and I was actually surprised because in many of my ethics classes, my philosophy professors would present this as like a rock-solid logical argument against the existence of God. The only thing is they didn't present it as a logic argument. They would just generally present it as a statement and some consequences arising from that statement. You know, very generally, if God exists, why is there evil in the world? Now, what was ironic was those very same professors had trained me in logic and critical thinking, okay? They had taught me how to formulate a valid and sound argument, that you needed to have premises that led to a conclusion. The conclusion needed to follow logically from those premises. And when we would talk about the problem of evil, it was never formatted as an actual logical argument with premises from which a conclusion followed. And it occurred to me in college, and even since then, whenever I hear this argument come up, that if in order for this argument to carry any weight whatsoever in terms of posing a challenge to theism, then you need to be able to state it in an actual formal logical argument. It can't simply just be a statement, well, evil exists, so how could God possibly exist? If you're content with that as a justification for not believing God, you're being intellectually lazy. So let's take a look at it. Can this actually be formulated as a logical argument? And is it a legitimate challenge to theism? So the argument actually goes back thousands of years. You had Greek philosopher Epicurus say, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? Victor Stenger recently wrote a book called God, the Failed Hypothesis, where he coined the term 3-0 and in terms of defining the typical conception of a theist has of God, which is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. I'm going to use that terminology for the remainder of the video just for the sake of brevity and ease, but just know that that's what we're talking about. Omnipotent means all-powerful, omnibenevolent means all good or all-loving, and omniscient means all-knowing, in case you were wondering. 3-0 is generally considered to be central to the beliefs of the three major monotheistic religions in terms of how they conceive of God or the attributes that they assign to God. So why is this argument so persuasive and why is it so common? Like, why every time there's a conversation about God and whether or not he exists, why does this always get tossed into the conversation? Well, I mean, we see the results of evil every day, all over the world. There's tremendous human suffering, and really there always has been. War, injustice, torture, trafficking, etc. And like I said, if we're being honest, this has sort of been the state of humanity since the dawn of time. And I think that we all think to ourselves, if only we had the power to stop it all, we would. You know, that's sort of like every single superhero movie out there, right? The superhero gains his powers, learns about them, and feels a responsibility to use it to sort of thwart evil in the world. And I think this is a natural, compassionate response that we have to the reality of evil. And so it leads to the question, it sort of begs the question, well, if there is a good and loving God, like, why did he allow all of this? Why isn't he intervening? Why didn't he stop the Holocaust, for example? But is there an actual logical argument here? Okay? If you're going to accept this as a legitimate reason to deny the existence of God, or even to deny that if there is a God, he has any sort of moral authority in your life, okay, then you need to be able, if you're being intellectually honest and intellectually rigorous, you need to be able to formulate this as a logical argument, okay? That's generally not the case, though, right? When the problem of evil is just tossed out into conversations about God, it's always just sort of the knee-jerk emotional reaction that somebody has, and it generally has, for however long they've been an atheist or an agnostic, it's served as their sort of personal justification for being so. So is it possible to present the problem of evil as a logical argument? Well, let's do a quick review about what that exactly is and what that would look like, okay? An argument is a set of premises, statements or propositions that seek to establish the truth of a conclusion, okay? There's a lot of different ways of sort of explaining what an argument is, but I think this does a good enough job. So in this instance, all snakes are reptiles. All reptiles lay eggs. Those two statements are your premises that are seeking to establish the truth of your conclusion, which in this case is therefore all snakes lay eggs. It's not enough, though, for it to be an argument. In order for it to carry any weight whatsoever, it needs to be valid, and it also needs to be sound, which we'll talk about both of those things. An argument, a valid argument, is an argument in which the conclusion logically follows from the premises, okay? So in this case, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The conclusion there logically follows from the premises. This is a classic syllogism. If you've ever taken a logic and critical thinking class, it's almost guaranteed that you've studied this syllogism, right? But what if the premises aren't true? Okay, you can still have a valid argument, an argument that is structured where the conclusion follows logically from the premises, but it's not sound because the premises aren't true. So an example here is all men are immortal, not true. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. In this case, our conclusion does logically follow from our premises, but one or more of the premises is not true. So we can see it's not enough for an argument to be valid. An argument also needs to be sound because we care about the truth of the conclusion, right? It's not good enough for it to be logical. We want to know that the conclusion we're coming to is true as well, right? So what does that look like? An argument is sound if and only if it is both valid and all of its premises are actually true, okay? If the conclusion follows logically from true premises, then the truth of the conclusion can also be guaranteed. So in this case, here's an example. All men are humans. All humans are mammals. Therefore, all men are mammals. Okay, here we have an argument that is both valid and sound and is true. What do you know? Okay, hopefully I haven't put you to sleep with this super basic overview of logic and critical thinking, but I think it's important to kind of establish my whole point in this video. Again, to recap, when I was in college, my professors used the problem of evil as sort of an argument against using God as the foundation for an ethical system, okay? So this was typically in the context of ethics classes, but it was never presented like this, as a series of premises leading to conclusions, okay? And that's because when you do that, problems arise. So this is what it might look like if we listed out all of the both explicit and implied premises and conclusions that are typically stated or assumed or derived from the problem of evil. All right. Typically, the way it's presented in conversation or even in classes, as I've indicated, is that how can God be good when there's evil in the world? So those two things are essentially premise 4 and conclusion 5. There is evil in the world, therefore God is not good or all powerful or all loving, etc., or omniscient, etc. All right. But really what's going on here is there's several implied premises, right? So let's look at items 1, 2, and 3. Premise 1, if there is a God, he must be 3-0. 2, if God is 3-0, he would desire to create a world in which there is no evil. Okay. 3, if God is 3-0, he would have the power to actualize a world in which there is no evil. 4, there is evil in the world. All right, 5, therefore God is not 3-0. And then 6 is also generally sort of assumed, especially by people who use the problem of evil as their personal justification for not believing in God. They basically make a big leap from 5 to 6. That God is not 3-0, or God cannot be 3-0, therefore God doesn't exist, okay? Now the agnostic is just going to say, they're just going to stop with 5 and be content with 5. Generally, they're going to say, I can't even know God because he's so high above me, or he's unknowable, or he's hidden himself, or whatever, okay? They're generally going to be content with conclusion 5, but most people, like the lay person who's just out there and is content to believe that God doesn't exist because evil, they make this big jump in logic from 5 to 6. Now, as I've previously stated, it's not enough for this argument to be valid. Okay, the argument needs to be sound, which means the premises need to be true so that we know that the conclusions which follow logically are true as well. The burden is really on the atheist here, or the person who's presenting this argument. The burden is on them to show that each of these premises are true. Okay, so let's look at each one and ask ourselves, are these true? All right, number 1, if there is a God, he must be 3-0. Okay, we are already running into a roadblock here because this premise is not self-evidently true. okay? Or necessarily true, as we might call it in modal logic, true in all possible worlds, okay? If it is not self-evidently true, that means that you need to establish its truth. And so in itself, it is a conclusion that needs its own premises establishing its truth, all right? So we're already running into an issue here because this is a presupposition. This is an assumption that has not been established via a logical argument of some sort. What about premise 2? If God is 3-0, he would desire to create a world in which there is no evil. Okay, well, we're going to run into the same problem here. You would have to show that this premise is self-evidently true, or true in all possible worlds, okay? But we can, of course, conceive of a world where maybe God doesn't want to create a world in which there is no evil, okay? Theists will typically argue that we can easily conceive of a possible world where God allows evil so that human freedom, and thus love, for example, are both possible and meaningful. Okay, well, that's 2 strikes. What about premise 3? If God is 3-0, he would have the power to actualize a world in which there is no evil. Okay, now this one is we're a little closer to having something here because it seems self-evidently true on the surface until we examine the concept of omnipotence in a little more detail. The concept of omnipotence as the power/ability to do anything is not actually rational, okay? It becomes immediately apparent as soon as you start breaking it down a little bit that logical absurdities arise from the concept of omnipotence in the way that it is commonly discussed, especially in these settings, okay? So, for instance, if God is all-powerful, can he make a square circle? If God can do anything, can he, for instance, create a rock that's too heavy for himself to lift? Now, these were actual criticisms that were levied against the concept of God as an omnipotent creator by my professors in college, which I always thought did a little bit of an intellectual disservice to us as students, because I think it was pretty apparent to all of us that that's not the actual way that theists typically conceive of omnipotence. Theists do not defend the concept of omnipotence as the ability to do anything, even though that's the caricature of theism that is typically presented by atheists. The theistic concept of an omnipotent God is more, I think, accurately defined as a maximally powerful supreme being. Okay, that is a being whose power is as great as logically possible, only bounded by his very essence, nature, and character. The laws of logic are typically asserted by theists as part of the essence of God, and therefore his power is bounded by the laws of logic. So there are no theists who will tell you that God can make a square circle. And here's the point where we really see that this argument comes down really to the nature of free will and the nature of good and evil, which we'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, theists will argue that there are no possible worlds that God could actualize where a significantly free creature does not choose to do at least one morally reprehensible action. In Alvin Plantinga's famous free will defense, he coined the term transworld depravity. And that's the idea that all significantly free creatures are transworld depraved. And here's generally the point at which atheists and theists will get stuck on in this debate, and why the problem of evil ultimately becomes an argument about free will and about the nature of good and evil themselves. And that's essentially because it all boils down to this. What is the nature of free will? Is it even possible for a divine supreme being to create a world of free creatures who are morally perfect? And the theists are generally going to say no, that's not, because they wouldn't be free then. They would be some sort of automaton or robot if they always chose to do the right thing every time. It's just part and parcel of the nature of free will that creatures are transworld depraved. And meanwhile, on the other side of things, atheists will typically argue that for a more deterministic view of the universe, that essentially we are just a product of biological processes. We're just matter and energy colliding across space and time. Free will is an illusion. All we have is a very materialistic universe that is governed by the laws of physics, and the choices that you make are really just products of all of the experiences that you've had up to this point, or more so all of the chemical reactions that have happened in your brain up to this point. You know, the point is that there's a huge debate over the very nature of free will and whether or not it exists, and that's ultimately what this problem comes down to. And I will be making more videos down the road about free will, because it's an incredibly important concept to dive into. There's different conceptions of free will, there's different arguments against free will, and there's very prominent atheists today like Sam Harris who argue that free will is simply just an illusion. Okay, but moving on to our final premise, there is evil in the world. Okay, once again, we have a premise here that is not self-evident, and this one is perhaps the most important because it's generally explicitly stated, right? If God is good, or if he's all loving, or if God exists, why is there evil in the world? This is like the big dog premise of it. Anytime the problem of evil is presented in any setting, it presumes that everyone in the room accepts the objective reality of evil, that everyone accepts that there are certain things that are evil independent of human experience. For instance, murder or rape, the Holocaust. Those things are objectively bad. There's something outside of us that points to the fact that they're evil, right? Well, the objective reality of good and evil is hotly debated, especially by atheists, okay? So atheists going back to J.L. Mackie have contested whether good and evil actually exist. If the universe is just matter and energy colliding across space and time, then there is no good and evil. Those are just concepts we assign to different chemical reactions, okay? At best, good and evil are useful conceptions that aid in survival of the species through the evolutionary process. At worst, they're completely irrational concepts that do not exist and have no substantive meaning. Now, theists, of course, have no problem with the objective reality of good and evil. It's part of the foundation of what a theist believes about God and the world. And essentially, how it's typically proposed is that we know the difference between good and evil because of the moral law. The moral law is given by a moral law giver, which is essentially God. And the moral law is essentially his very nature and character. Okay, it's not just arbitrary commands that he's given, but rather his very nature and character. So the good is everything that is consistent with the nature and character of God, and evil is everything that's inconsistent with the nature and character of God. So independent of human experience, things like murder, rape, torture, the Holocaust, etc., are objectively evil because they are inconsistent with the nature and character of the Supreme Being. Now, there are atheists, Sam Harris, who I mentioned previously about free will, in recent years have attempted to argue for the objective reality of good and evil within an atheistic context. I think Sam's arguments are completely logically incoherent and ridiculous, and we'll deal with them in later videos. But I do want to commend Sam because he is an intellectual thinker that I really admire and respect. I do want to commend him for recognizing something that most new atheists simply do not recognize or refuse to recognize, and that is the fact that if evil is an illusion, then you really don't have grounds for your atheism. So many of the arguments that atheists levy against theism or religion in general kind of rely on the fact that evil is actually a real thing, because they'll say like religious institutions are evil or have perpetrated so much evil in the world since their founding. Well, those arguments hold no weight whatsoever if evil is just an illusion. So at least Sam has recognized the fact that you need evil to be an objective reality in order to continue to argue for atheism. However, like I said, upon careful scrutiny, especially in terms of a context of formal logic, I think his arguments break down, and we'll deal with those in later videos. So moving on to the conclusions, I think we've shown that because the premises are not self-evidently true, we can't establish the truth of these conclusions, okay? The argument itself is just sort of a hot mess of assumptions or presuppositions, okay? If you're willing to dig into each of these and really hash them out to determine truth and validity, ultimately you're going to come down to a discussion of good and evil and free will and the nature of each of those things. And that's what happens and has been happening for decades in the scholarly literature, but hasn't been happening in just popular conversation. Okay, when the problem of evil is tossed out there, as it often is done by the new atheists, okay, it's generally meant to influence people's emotion, right? Okay, and this is actually a logical fallacy. The problem of evil is literally an appeal to emotion, okay? This is the manipulation of the recipient's emotions in order to win an argument, especially in the absence of factual evidence, or what I would say in the absence of actual logical argumentation. This is a very common and powerful debate tactic. It's employed everywhere across culture today. Everybody is guilty of it, no matter what you believe, because it's effective. And humans are easily swayed in their beliefs by their emotions and by powerful and persuasive appeals to emotion, right? That's what our politicians do. That's what religious leaders do. That's what the new atheists do. And the fact of the matter is, sadly, most people determine the validity of a belief based upon how they subjectively feel about it. They don't really want to dive deep and think about the presuppositions or the assumptions that are made, the premises or the propositions that are being stated. And they certainly aren't thinking about whether the argument is sound or valid. And the reality is, it's just easier to feel your way through life and what you believe than to analytically think your way into and through your beliefs. All right, I'm going to wrap it up there. But obviously, this issue leads to so many further conversations about good and evil, free will, atheism versus theism, etc. And I hope to explore a lot of those questions in future videos. So please give me a like and give me a subscribe and keep an eye out for future content. I hope to be releasing it on a regular basis, and follow me on the social medias, my friends. I hope to be posting there and putting my thoughts out into the marketplace of ideas on a regular basis. Appreciate your support. Thanks.